I always imagined walking my daughter down the aisle would be the proudest moment of my life. Not the day she graduated, not her first job offer, not even the night she whispered, "I love you, Daddy," with ice cream on her chin. No, it was always that image, her arm in mine, the music swelling, her eyes brimming with joy, and mine brimming with something much deeper. Love, and maybe a little bit of disbelief. Disbelief that time could move so quickly. That this tiny girl I once rocked to sleep would someday wear white and choose someone else to walk life with. But sometimes life doesn't give you the scenes you've rehearsed in your heart. The envelope came on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Not hand-delivered, not with a call or a hug or a word. Just an envelope, nestled among a stack of bills and advertisements, as though it meant no more than a supermarket flyer. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind you feel guilty folding. Her name was there, of course, Evelyn Marie Chambers, and beside it, a man's name I'd only heard once in passing. The date, the location, the attire, a perfect list. But my name was missing. At first I thought it was a mistake. Surely they'd forgotten to address the RSVP card. Surely there was an insert missing. I flipped the envelope over, checked the floor to see if something had fallen out. Nothing. I read the invitation again. Still nothing. No father of the bride. No RSVP request. No seat assignment. No mention of me at all. I called her. I knew I shouldn't. I knew that if I opened that door, I might hear something I couldn't unhear. But silence can feel like drowning when it's someone you love. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was cheerful, breathless. "Hey, Dad. What's up?" "I got the invitation," I said softly. A pause. Then, "Oh. There must have been a mistake," I continued. "There's no RSVP card. I didn't see my name." Another pause, this one longer. "It wasn't a mistake," she said. And then, as if rehearsed, she added, "It's just easier this way. You'll make things awkward." Those words hit harder than I thought words could. I stayed quiet, waiting for something, anything, that might soften the blow. She didn't offer one. "It's complicated with Mom," she went on, "and with Robert's parents. You know how they are. I just don't want any tension. I want it to be perfect. Perfect, as if my presence was a stain. I wanted to scream. Not because I was angry, but because I was devastated. I raised this girl. I held her tiny hand on the first day of kindergarten. I sat through ballet recitals and science fairs. I took extra shifts at the auto shop to pay her tuition when the scholarship didn't cover everything. I watched her cry into her pillow the night her high school boyfriend broke her heart. I was there, through it all. Now I was a footnote in her story, or worse, erased. She kept talking, filling the silence with platitudes. "I'm not saying I don't love you, Dad. You've always meant a lot to me. But this is my day. I need it to go smoothly." I didn't argue. What was the point? Love shouldn't have to beg for space. When we hung up, I stared at the wall for what felt like an hour, blinking slowly, letting the silence wrap around me like a cold wind. The day before the wedding, I found myself doing something I never thought I'd do. Watching my daughter's rehearsal on a friend's phone. George, my neighbor, had connections. His niece was a server at the venue. She agreed to send a live feed. "Thought you'd want to see it," George said, setting the phone in my hand with a knowing look. The screen was small, and the connection cut out every few minutes, but it didn't matter. I saw her, my Evelyn. Dressed in white, her hair swept up the way she used to do when she was nervous. She looked beautiful, but I wasn't watching her as a proud father. I was watching her as a ghost, unseen, uninvited, and unneeded. I saw her walk down the aisle with her mother, saw her laughing with the groom's family. I heard someone, maybe the wedding planner, say, "Let's run it once more. Evelyn, walk like your father is here." And she laughed. That laugh. It wasn't cruel, but it broke something inside me. George sat beside me, silent, respectful. He didn't say a word, and I was grateful. Words felt useless. What do you say when the person you love most doesn't want you in the happiest chapter of their life? But then, something strange happened. The camera shifted toward the altar. The minister, the same man who baptized Evelyn when she was a baby, stood silently, arms folded. He didn't smile. He didn't participate. When someone asked if he was ready to begin, he shook his head. "Not without her father," he said. "I told her I wouldn't perform the ceremony unless he was here." I sat up straight. "What did he say?" I whispered, even though no one could hear me. George rewound the feed. We listened again. The same words, the same defiance, the same loyalty I never expected. Suddenly, the tightness in my chest loosened just a little. I looked around my tiny home, the peeling wallpaper, the old photographs, the empty chair beside mine. I had spent years living small so she could dream big. And now she'd locked me out of her dream. But not everyone had forgotten. "She didn't want me there," I said, my voice quiet, raw. George didn't respond. He didn't need to. I looked down at the screen again, frozen on my daughter's face, lit with joy and promise. Then I looked out the window. The sky was bruised with the color of nightfall. The lake shimmered in the distance. "She didn't want me there," I repeated. Then I stood up, slowly, like someone remembering who they used to be. But I had a promise to keep. And this time, I intended to keep it. There was a time when she was mine. Not in the sense of ownership, but in the way a father holds the whole world in his arms, wrapped in a blanket, smelling faintly of baby powder and midnight feedings. That time seems like another lifetime now, blurred by years and distance, but it still lives in the cracks of my memory. Before tuxedos and floral centerpieces, before seating charts and guest lists, before she decided that my presence was too much for her perfect day. It all started after I lost her mother. Evelyn was only 5 when cancer came knocking, cold and uninvited. My wife, Maria, was the kind of woman who made ordinary days feel like celebrations. She used to hum while folding laundry, made pancakes in silly shapes on Sundays, and always kissed us goodbye, even if we were only heading to the corner store. When she passed, the world didn't feel right anymore. It was like someone had turned down the volume on life. I remember the night of the funeral, Evelyn curled up next to me in our bed, clutching the hem of her mother's old sweater. Her tiny voice whispered, "Is Mommy gone forever?" I didn't have an answer then. I don't think I do now. But from that moment on, I made a vow, not to God, not even to Maria, but to my daughter. I would be both mother and father. I would be enough. And so I began a life that didn't leave room for self-pity. I took the graveyard shift at the auto shop. It was the only way I could drop her off at school every morning and still be back in time for dinner. I skipped lunches so I could afford ballet lessons. I turned down a managerial role, one that would have meant longer hours and more money, because I didn't want to miss her growing up. We built a world together, just the two of us. I became an expert at ponytails and science projects, learning how to make papier-mâché volcanoes erupt and how to braid hair in the back seat before school started. I cheered the loudest at her soccer games, even when she was more interested in picking flowers on the field. And on nights when the house felt too quiet, we made popcorn, built pillow forts, and watched old movies until we fell asleep on the couch. There was this one night I'll never forget. Evelyn had just turned 11. She'd fallen off her bike and scraped her knee, more embarrassment than pain. As I cleaned the wound and held her close, she looked up at me with those tear-filled eyes and said, "I'm glad it's you, Daddy." Just 5 words, but I carried them like a medal of honor. I never did it for praise, never wanted a spotlight or applause. My love wasn't loud, but it was steady. I gave because it was the only way I knew how to love, fully, quietly, without condition. When she turned 16, I spent the last of my savings on a second-hand car, just so she wouldn't have to take the bus to her internship across town. She didn't ask for it. She never even expected it. That made it matter more. Her eyes lit up like Christmas morning, and in that moment I thought, this is what being a parent is. The joy of giving, with no strings attached. Through the years, I watched her become a woman of strength and ambition. She earned scholarships, built friendships, found her voice. I stayed in the background, clapping quietly with every milestone, never asking for anything except to be part of her journey. But slowly, I felt something shift. It began subtly. Phone calls became fewer, texts less frequent. I told myself it was natural. Young adults, busy lives. Then came the new boyfriend, Robert. Polished, confident, the kind of man who measured worth by brand names and boardroom connections. I didn't mind him, not at first, until I noticed how Evelyn changed when he was around. Her laughter became softer, her gaze a bit more distant. She stopped inviting me to dinner, skipped Father's Day once, twice. Still, I didn't complain. I held tight to the memories that made us a team. I believed, maybe foolishly, that love like ours didn't fade. It might be buried under stress and adulthood, but surely it would find its way back. One evening, long before any wedding invitations were sent, I was sitting on the porch, watching the wind move through the pine trees. The sun was just setting, and the lake reflected the golden light like a secret mirror. I remember hearing Maria's voice, not in a haunting way, but like a whisper from some other world. I'd kept one of her voicemails, saved on an old flip phone in the drawer beside my bed. Sometimes, when the house felt especially empty, I'd listen. "Be the man she'll someday thank," she once told me. "Even if she doesn't realize it yet." I played that line again and again. Let it sink into my bones. Let it guide me. So I kept showing up, quietly. I mailed birthday cards, even when they went unacknowledged. Sent her books I thought she'd like. Repaired the leaky faucet in her apartment when she wasn't home. Little things, invisible things. But love often lives in the invisible. And now, here I am, just one day before the biggest moment of her life, watching her walk down a rehearsal aisle on a screen the size of my palm. I should be next to her. I should be the one whispering, "You look just like your mother did on our wedding day." Instead, I'm sitting on a creaky armchair, in a house filled with memories that apparently matter more to me than to her. Still, I don't feel bitterness. No, what I feel is something deeper. A quiet ache, yes, but also clarity. She was once mine, my daughter, my everything. And though time and choices have pulled us apart, I know the truth. The kind of love I gave her doesn't vanish. It lives in her confidence, in her ability to love, in the strength she carries without realizing its origin. She may not thank me now. She may never. But I kept my promise to love her with everything I had, even if she never looks back. And tomorrow, I intend to keep one more promise. Because someone once told me, be the man she'll someday thank, even if she doesn't realize it yet. People like to talk about disappearing acts as if they happen overnight. A puff of smoke, a slam of the door, a suitcase by the curb. But in my case, it was quieter than that. I didn't vanish. I was erased, one forgotten phone call at a time, one ignored message, one missed invitation. It wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a fading, slow, and deliberate, like a photograph left out in the sun until the colors dull and the outlines blur. The girl I once carried on my shoulders at county fairs, the one who clapped for every magic trick I pretended to know, she was now someone else's pride, someone else's story to tell. And somewhere along the way, my name had been written out of her narrative. It began with little things. A conversation at a charity gala she invited me to years ago, back when she still remembered I existed. Someone had asked, "How did you become such a strong woman?" And without hesitation, she smiled and said, "My mom raised me to be resilient." I remember standing just a few feet away, holding a glass of water that suddenly felt much heavier in my hand. I didn't make a scene. I simply nodded and smiled, like any polite guest would. But deep inside, something cracked. A small fracture, not visible yet, but sharp enough to hurt. I wanted to believe she misspoke, that maybe it was nerves or social pressure. But that same story repeated itself. At brunches, interviews, even her social media captions. The single father who gave up everything slowly vanished from her history, replaced by a sanitized version that fit her new image. Raised by a widowed mother, shaped by her own strength and ambition. There was no room for greasy hands that fixed broken bike chains. No space for a father who smelled of oil and pine-scented soap, whose hands were calloused from years under the hood of cars. That version of her life didn't match the narrative that impressed the kind of people she now kept close. Her fiancé's family was old money. Not loud about it, just casually unaware of anything outside their gated world. I met them once, briefly. They greeted me with polite smiles that didn't touch their eyes. We exchanged small talk over wine I couldn't pronounce, in a home that looked like a magazine layout. His mother had looked me over, pausing at my worn jacket sleeves and scuffed shoes, and asked, "And what do you do, sir?" When I replied that I was a retired mechanic who owned a small workshop in town, she tilted her head and smiled as if I had confessed to being a circus clown. I could see it then, in my daughter's eyes. Embarrassment. Not just for me, but of me. She had crossed into a new world, one where wealth wasn't counted in hard-earned savings or sacrifices made quietly, but in names, reputations, and curated stories. And I was a misfit in her polished life. Too rough around the edges, too honest, too much of a reminder of where she came from. She started screening my calls. At first, I thought she was just busy. Then I noticed the pattern. Texts left unread, invitations ignored. I'd call to say I missed her, to ask how she was, and days would pass in silence. I wasn't angry, not yet. Just confused, then worried. Was she okay? Was I becoming a burden? That word echoed often. Burden. When she got engaged, I heard about it not from her, but from an old friend who saw the announcement online. The post was polished. Her and Robert on a yacht. His hand gently on her waist. The caption glowing with gratitude for our incredible journey together. shaped by love and the strength of family. Family. Not one mention of me. Not even a courtesy call. I told myself she'd come around. That maybe the wedding planning was overwhelming. That surely, when the day came, she'd remember the man who taught her how to dance by swaying barefoot on the kitchen floor to Elvis Presley. Then came the invitation, or rather, the lack of it. I received a beautiful, embossed card from her address. I remember the envelope well, ivory with a delicate gold seal. My hands trembled a little as I opened it. I was nervous, like a schoolboy waiting to see if his name made the list. Inside, the names of guests, instructions for attire, RSVP codes, but no mention of me. I flipped the card over, checked the envelope again. Nothing. It wasn't a mistake. Later that evening, I called her. My voice was calm, but inside I was holding a dam together. "Darling," I said gently, "I noticed the wedding invite didn't have my name on it. Perhaps an error?" There was a long pause. Then she replied, not cruelly, not with malice, just flat, like someone closing a door. "It's just easier this way, Dad. You'll make things awkward with Robert's family. You know how they are. Please understand." Please understand. What she was really asking was, please disappear. Please don't complicate the image I'm trying to sell. I hung up the phone. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, in the same worn recliner I used to rock her to sleep in. The clock ticked. The shadows lengthened across the floor. My heart didn't shatter. It hollowed. But I'm not a man who holds grudges. And I'm certainly not a man who takes back what he's given. You see, months before all this, I had quietly arranged for several vendors to be paid. The catering deposit, the venue's lighting team, even the minister's honorarium. I'd funded those through anonymous donations. Not because I wanted recognition. Not because I wanted to buy my way into her day. I did it because I believed she deserved a beautiful start. No matter how she saw me now. That's the kind of father I am. Or was. Or maybe still am. Even if I've become invisible in her eyes. I thought of pulling the payments, canceling the checks, making a statement. But that would make me small. And I wasn't raised to be small. My wife, bless her soul, used to say, "Real strength isn't in how loud you roar. It's in how quietly you carry the weight." So I carried it. The hurt, the exclusion, the rewriting of my role. But I also carried something else. A decision. Because while she didn't want me there, I had made a promise long ago. The day she was born, as I held her tiny frame against my chest, I whispered, "Wherever you walk, I'll be behind you, even if you don't see me." And I meant it. Even now. Especially now. It was the kind of day you'd expect from a wedding out of a lifestyle magazine. Clear skies, sunlight spilling across the stone paths of a vineyard estate. Rows of white chairs adorned with blush-colored ribbons. And a floral arch that looked like it belonged in a cathedral, not the countryside. From where I stood, just beyond the iron gates, behind the hydrangea hedges, everything looked perfect. Except, of course, for the one imperfection they tried so hard to keep out. Me. I had dressed with care that morning, not to impress anyone, but because I'd promised her mother I would. A clean navy suit, polished shoes, and the same silver tie clip Maria had given me on our wedding day. I stood outside the venue, not pacing, not planning to crash anything, just waiting. I knew what time the ceremony would begin. I knew the order of events. I'd read the rehearsal schedule when a friend sent me a photo of it. It was all scripted, down to the second. And yet, I also knew life rarely follows scripts. I couldn't see much from where I was, but I could hear the distant murmurs of guests settling into their seats, the soft hum of a string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon, the shuffle of expensive shoes on stone as the bridal party lined up. A part of me braced to feel pain. Again. To hear her vows from afar and swallow the grief like I had all year. But what happened next wasn't something I had planned. It was something I would have never dared to hope for. The music stopped. Not faded, not slowed. It stopped, mid-measure, like someone had dropped their violin. A pause hung in the air, unnatural and heavy. I held my breath. From my angle, I saw the minister step forward. He stood at the center of the altar, adjusting his robe, looking composed, but not quite at ease. I had met Reverend Thomas nearly 15 years earlier, though back then he wasn't Reverend anything. Just a kid named Eli, fresh out of foster care, working night shifts at the garage to afford community college. I'd hired him when no one else would. Let him sleep on the pull-out cot in the back room for a few weeks. Fed him when he was too proud to ask. I remembered the day he came to me with tears in his eyes, holding the acceptance letter to seminary school saying, "You're the reason I believe God didn't forget me." I never asked for anything in return. Now there he stood, older, confident, a spiritual guide for hundreds. And suddenly, he wasn't speaking. Not the opening prayer, not the welcome. He just turned toward the groom, whispered something quietly, then moved toward my daughter. Even from outside, I could hear her hissed reply, "He's not invited." Then, the words that would echo through my bones for the rest of my life came from Eli's lips, calm but resolute. "Then I cannot perform this ceremony." Silence crashed over the crowd. It was the kind of silence that made people shift in their chairs, lean forward, whisper behind hands. My daughter blinked. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice no longer graceful or poised, but strained. "The guests are here. The vows are ready. This is not the time." But he held up a gentle hand. "I'm sorry, but I would not be standing here in this life, in this calling, if it weren't for your father. I owe my very path to his kindness and sacrifice, and I will not bless a union built on exclusion." The words hit like thunder, not just to her, but to the guests, the groom, the entire venue. Murmurs rose like wind. Some guests turned in their seats, craning their necks. Others exchanged glances, unsure whether to stay or leave. My daughter turned red. Embarrassment, fury, or maybe shame. She looked around like someone realizing they'd walked into a room without clothes on. Her fiancé tried to calm her, placing a hand on her arm, but she shook it off. Then I saw Eli lean down to one of the ushers and whisper something. Moments later, a young man in a black vest stepped through the archway and looked around, until his eyes met mine. "Sir?" he asked cautiously, walking toward me. "Are you her father?" I nodded slowly. My hands resting in front of me did not tremble. "Reverend Thomas would like you to come inside," he said. "He won't start without you." I could have refused. I could have said, "She didn't want me. Let her feel the weight of that." I could have turned away, holding on to my pride like a shield. But pride had never built a home. Love had. So I walked, steady and slow, through the gate, past the whispering guests, all the way to the front row. As I moved through the aisle, there was no music, no applause, just a respectful quiet, like people witnessing something sacred they didn't fully understand. My daughter stood frozen at the altar, eyes wide. Her mouth opened as if to say something, then closed again. I took my seat in the front row, not beside anyone, not beneath the floral arch, but exactly where I was supposed to be. Eli gave me the faintest nod, one filled with decades of gratitude, then turned to the guests. "Now," he said, "we may begin." The ceremony continued. The vows were read, the rings exchanged, but something had shifted in the room. The glamour had cracked. What remained was something far more real, raw, and true. And in that quiet reckoning, I didn't feel anger. I felt seen. I felt remembered. I felt returned. They say the loudest moments in life are often the quietest, when a heart breaks, when a truth lands, when the shape of love is finally understood after years of misunderstanding. That moment came seconds after the final vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the crowd began to relax. The applause had started to rise when my daughter turned toward me, her eyes wet but unreadable, and her lips trembled as she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" The words weren't accusatory. They were not sharp. They were hollow, not from anger, but from disbelief, like someone who had just unearthed a truth they weren't ready for. The same daughter who told me I'd make things awkward, the one who omitted my name from invitations, now stood on the edge of everything she thought she knew and everything she had forgotten. I rose slowly, not because I needed to, but because there's a certain weight dignity carries, and it deserves to move with care. The room turned. The string quartet had fallen silent again, their bows resting in midair. Guests shifted in their chairs. The groom's family, once smug, now stiff, looked anywhere but at me. I stepped closer to the altar, not to steal the spotlight, but because there was one final truth to deliver. And when the world quiets enough, the truth doesn't need a microphone. "I was never invited," I said, my voice steady, not raised, so I stayed outside. A murmur swept the room like a cold breeze through silk curtains. My daughter's hands twitched at her sides. "But love," I continued, eyes on hers, "isn't about showing up where you're welcomed. It's about staying where you're needed, even if you're left at the edge, even if the door never opens." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, simple. No frills. I handed it to her with both hands, the way one offers something sacred. She opened it slowly, like one afraid of what it might contain. Inside, a neat stack of folded papers. Receipts, confirmation emails, donation slips. The wedding dress, paid in full under a bridal charity. The venue's second deposit, marked anonymous. Catering upgrades, handled through a friend's shell company. And the largest one, an old church fund marked for Eli Thomas, dated 15 years ago. Her hands shook. One page fluttered to the floor. She looked up, mouth parted, voice cracking. "You did all of this?" I nodded once. "You deserved the day, even if I wasn't part of it." And that was the moment the dam broke. Not just in her, but in the room. She collapsed into sobs, clutching the box to her chest, like it might anchor her from the guilt now flooding in. The crowd, stunned into silence, watched as the bride's perfect makeup melted into mascara trails of realization. The groom's parents, who had barely acknowledged me earlier, now sat stiff-backed and pale. His mother's lips were pressed together, her eyes glistening, but not with empathy. Embarrassment. Shame has its own language. It doesn't shout. It stares. I turned then, without bitterness, without triumph. There was nothing left to say. Not really. I had done what I came to do. Not to make a scene, not to steal the show, but to honor a promise made in the quiet of a hospital room decades ago, when Maria whispered, "Promise me you'll show up for her, even if she doesn't see it." So I had, not loudly, but faithfully. I stepped down the aisle, my pace measured, heart calm, when her voice stopped me. "Dad." I turned. She took one uncertain step off the altar, the hem of her dress catching on the edge. Her eyes were red, her voice hoarse but clear. "Please, walk me down the aisle." Every breath in the room seemed to hold itself. I looked at her. At the girl I taught to tie her shoes. The girl I carried home after dance recitals when she fell asleep in the car. The girl who had, for a while, lost her way. And I realized in that moment, she wasn't asking me to walk her down the aisle for the sake of ceremony. She was asking for forgiveness. I nodded. We met halfway. No dramatic music, no applause. Just a father and his daughter, bridging a canyon that had taken years to form. She took my arm, tentative at first, then firmer. I felt the tremble in her fingers, and I squeezed gently, the way I used to when she was scared. Together, we walked. Not just the remaining few steps to the front, but through years of distance. Through the misunderstandings, the silences, the pain neither of us had known how to speak aloud. As we stood before the crowd once again, this time side by side, she turned to the minister and whispered, "Start over." And he did. The ceremony restarted, not from the top, but from the heart. This time her father stood by her side, not just in proximity, but in truth. And as she said her vows again, clearer, more grounded, I saw in her eyes not the woman who tried to erase me, but the little girl who once made me promise never to miss a school play. She hadn't forgotten me. She had only forgotten herself. But in that moment, in front of everyone, she found her way back. Her hand in mine felt smaller than I remembered. It wasn't the hand of a bride, not in that moment. It was the hand of a daughter reaching backward through time, toward the man who taught her how to tie her shoelaces, who steadied her handlebars on her first bike ride, who sat beside her when the world felt too big. Now, after all the silence, all the distance, all the forgetting, she had remembered. Or perhaps she had simply seen me again, not as the man she thought she had outgrown, but as the root that had quietly held her up. We walked forward together, not because the moment demanded ceremony, but because the moment offered redemption. The crowd stood. It was a quiet kind of reverence, not the rehearsed sort that follows protocol, but the genuine rising-on instinct kind that comes when hearts are cracked open. Some people clapped, others dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs. I caught sight of Reverend Thomas, his eyes shining, his hands folded in front of him. Even the groom, who had stood awkwardly a moment before, now watched us with something close to awe. My daughter's grip tightened slightly as we reached the altar. I looked over at her, and for a moment, her mask dropped completely. What I saw wasn't shame anymore. It was vulnerability. It was the terrifying, beautiful weight of seeing someone you love not as an obstacle, but as part of your foundation. We stood together, and the ceremony resumed. This time, it wasn't about floral arrangements or seating charts or Instagram-worthy moments. It was about truth. Broken, humbled, reclaimed truth. As the minister began the words that mark a union, I leaned in slightly and whispered to her, "I forgive you, not because you asked, but because I need the peace." She closed her eyes as if the words reached a place nothing else could. I didn't need an apology wrapped in a speech. I didn't need the spotlight or a grand gesture. I just needed to say it out loud. For me and maybe for her too. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about clearing the ledger between two people. Sometimes it's about lightening the weight of what we carry alone. The ceremony proceeded with a grace that can only come from something real. As they exchanged their vows, I felt the air shift, not in temperature, but in tone. It wasn't just a marriage taking place. It was a mending, a reweaving of what had unraveled. Later, during the reception, someone offered me the microphone to give a toast. I declined politely, smiling, then handed my daughter a folded letter instead. I had written it the night before, knowing there was a small chance I'd never get to read it aloud, but a bigger chance it would matter someday. She took it with both hands, curious. I watched her sit with her husband beneath the canopy of string lights and open the letter. She read quietly while the noise of clinking glasses and laughter danced around them. In that letter, I didn't speak of disappointment or regret. I spoke of roots. I was not your castle, it began, but I was your soil. I was never the flash, never the chandelier, but I was the beam that held up the roof when the storms came. I wrote of sacrifice, not as a badge but as a quiet legacy, of the nights I chose home over overtime, of the meals I skipped so she wouldn't notice an empty pantry, of the dreams I set aside not out of defeat, but out of love. I reminded her gently that we are not made small by humility, we are made strong by it. The world will often ask you to prove your worth by how loudly you shine, I wrote, but remember this, stars don't scream to be seen, they simply stay constant. I ended the letter with a simple sentence I knew she wouldn't forget. Humility doesn't make you small. It makes you unshakable. As she finished reading, I saw her bring a hand to her mouth and turn away for a moment. Her husband placed a hand on her back. She nodded to herself, as if she had just been handed a compass, and maybe she had. We spoke only briefly that evening, nothing heavy or long. She hugged me for the first time in years. There was no grand apology, no attempt to make up for lost time in a single sentence, and I didn't expect it. What mattered wasn't what was said, but what shifted in the space between us. I saw it in the way she leaned toward me, not out of obligation, but out of need. I saw it in the way her new husband shook my hand and held it for a beat longer than necessary. I saw it in the way the guests now looked at me, not with confusion, but with newfound respect. That night, as the party continued and I made my quiet exit, I walked back to my car parked at the far edge of the vineyard. The stars were out, soft and unassuming, constant. I didn't leave feeling triumphant. I left feeling whole. The stars were beginning to settle into the navy quilt of evening as I stepped away from the celebration. No spotlight followed me. No one raised a glass to toast my name. There were no lingering hands pulling me to stay. No shouts of one more dance from the crowd. And that was perfectly fine. Because I hadn't come to be seen. I had come to set something right. And now that it was, I wanted nothing more than to return to the quiet life I had built, far from chandeliers and curated smiles. The gravel crunched softly beneath my shoes as I walked to the edge of the vineyard where I had parked, away from the valet circle, away from the noise. I drove home in silence, letting the rhythm of the road replace the applause. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't ache. There was no weight left to carry. Only peace. That rare kind of peace that comes after a storm you didn't even know you were weathering. By the time I reached my driveway, the porch light I had forgotten to turn off was still glowing, casting a soft halo on the creaking wooden steps. As I opened the car door, A familiar sound reached my ears. The gentle thump of a tail wagging against old floorboards. There he was, my old retriever Max, waiting like he always did. Tongue lolling, eyes bright with the same unchanging love that had outlived birthdays and seasons. He didn't care what suit I wore or where I had been. I was home, and that was all that mattered. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, patting his head. "You wouldn't believe the day I've had." We stepped into the house together. Nothing had changed. The old grandfather clock still ticked its slow rhythm in the corner. The same creaky floorboard by the kitchen still complained under my heel. I boiled some water, pulled out my favorite chipped mug, and brewed a cup of tea, the kind Maria used to make on nights like this, when everything felt just a little too full. I carried the cup to the porch and sank into my rocking chair, the one with the cushion that never quite sat right. Max curled up beside me, letting out a satisfied sigh. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine from the woods beyond, and above, the stars were bolder here, unapologetically alive in the rural silence. As I took the first sip, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't check it. I rarely do after nightfall. But something nudged me. I set my tea down, pulled the phone out, and tapped the screen. One message. From her, just 2 words. "Thank you." No punctuation, no emojis, no grand apology tucked between exclamations. Just, "Thank you." It landed heavier than any speech could have. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I placed the phone face down on the table beside me, smiled to myself, and took another sip of tea. She didn't need to say more, and I didn't need to hear more, because in that brief sentence, I saw the whole picture. Not just of the wedding, but of everything. I saw the sleepless nights when she had fevers, the cardboard birthday crowns, the scraped knees, the college tuition checks, the moments she forgot, and the ones I never did. And I knew then, without any doubt, that I had done my part. I may not have danced at her wedding, but I had walked her through every season of life, through broken shoelaces and broken hearts, through her first day of school and her last day at home, through tears she never knew I saw and victories I never asked her to credit me for. That's the thing about love, real love. It doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't beg to be named. It doesn't insist on being center stage. It simply shows up again and again, until one day, long after it's gone unnoticed, someone turns around and finally sees it. I leaned back, letting the chair creak beneath me, and watched the wind toy with the leaves. Max stirred, then rested his head on my foot. In that silence, I felt something sacred. The kind of ending that doesn't need fanfare because it's built on truth, not performance. And to you, whoever you are reading or listening to this, I leave you with this. If the world forgets your worth, don't fight to remind them. Don't exhaust yourself shouting into the void. Don't wear yourself out chasing validation in places too shallow to contain your depth. Just live. Live with quiet courage, with dignity, with so much integrity that one day your silence becomes your loudest answer. Because when the applause fades and the stage is cleared, what remains isn't how many people noticed you. What remains is whether you stayed true to yourself, to your love, and to those who one day might say, "Thank you," when it finally matters. And that, my friend, is enough.